Support for Ben Franklin's World comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, proud citizens of vast early America and publishers of the OI Reader. The OI Reader is an app dedicated to exploring early American history. Within the app, you'll find high-resolution maps and images that you can enlarge and navigate, new and classic essays from the William & Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943, and special interactive content like our supplemental materials for the Doing History series. Have you seen the content the OI created for episode 130, Paul Revere's Ride Through History? It's fantastic. One of my favorite aspects of these resources is that I now have a place to put all the recordings that don't fit within the story I'm telling. So, for example, in the OI Reader, you'll find a great clip from Patrick Leahy of the Paul Revere Memorial Association telling us all about the Paul Revere House, how to tour it, and about all the different questions visitors ask him about the house. It's a really fun segment, and you'll find it only within the OI Reader. The OI Reader app is free, and it's available for all your favorite iOS and Android devices. Just visit your favorite app store and search for OI Reader, or visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader and download the app today.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 150 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Episode 150. Can you believe it? This is a big milestone, and I'm actually celebrating in a few ways. First, I bought a new mic. Well, actually, it's an old mic from the 1980s. It's an Electro Voice RE20, and I sound really good on it, so I bought it with the thought that it would be really cool and fitting to record a podcast about history on a somewhat historic mic. And I do have to use the word somewhat here, because I too am from the early 80s, and I don't consider myself historic. Another way I'm celebrating is I bought a bottle of whiskey that's been distilled according to George Washington's recipe from 1797. I'm going to open it and toast you, my partner Tim, our dog Sprocket, and all our friends at the Omohundro Institute for making this show and its success possible. Lastly, we're going to celebrate together with a great episode and a great guest. Abigail Adams is someone we think of when we think of women who lived through and participated in the American Revolution. We know that she was the wife of John Adams and the mother of John Quincy Adams, two presidents of the United States. We also know that she was a woman who advocated for women's rights, most famously in a March 31st, 1776 letter she wrote to her husband John, telling him, quote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors," end quote. But in today's episode, Woody Holton, a professor of history at the University of South Carolina and author of the biography Abigail Adams, is going to reveal to us a different and largely unknown aspect of Abigail Adams' life, her financial investments. Abigail Adams was a savvy investor, a role she grew into because the economy of the American Revolution and its war for independence required her and so many other early American women to take over their family's work and finances. Now, during this conversation, which will conclude our 6-part People of the American Revolution series, Woody discloses how Abigail Adams became an investor and the types of opportunities she invested in, how investing allowed Adams to implement some of her ideas about how the law should treat women, and how Adams viewed women and their place in American society during the mid to late 18th and early 19th centuries. But first, just a reminder that next week, episode 151 kicks off the Doing History to the Revolution series. I know we've been dropping teaser episodes and talking about this series all year long, but now it's time for the series to air. As part of this series, the Omohundro Institute will be releasing bonus content in the free OI Reader app, which you just heard me talk about at the start of the episode. Be sure to download it. It's free and available for all your favorite iOS and Android devices. Search for the OI Reader in your favorite app store, or visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader and download it. And you may just want to hit pause and download it right now, because I have a couple exciting surprises for you, which I'll tell you about at the end of the episode. Okay, are you ready for episode 150? Let me introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. His research focuses on the economic history of the American Revolution and on the experiences of African Americans, women, and Native Americans during the Revolution. He's the author of 3 books, including the Bancroft Prize winner Abigail Adams, and the author of many articles, including Abigail Adams' Bond Speculator, which appeared in the William and Mary Quarterly. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Woody Holton.
Thank you very much.
Woody, we're so glad you could join us here for episode 150 and to help us celebrate this milestone with a discussion about Abigail Adams, who was truly a remarkable woman in her own right.
Yeah, she sure was, in lots of ways that people don't know about as well as the ways that we do.
Well, perhaps this is a good starting point. Would you tell us about some of Adams's accomplishments and what prompted you to write a book and article about her?
Well, that leads to 2 separate answers. How I got into this topic was that I was doing my previous book, which was on the financial origins of the U.S. Constitution, and I ended up agreeing with Charles Beard that bond speculators were a real important part of the story that led to the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. And that stuff can really make people's eyes roll as you get into all these fiscal issues. And so I was really trying to find one of these guys, one of these bond speculators that I could use to put a face on all the others, I'd sort of use his biography to illustrate the case. And I could never find one of them that was really adequately documented. I might have an account book from this guy and letters from that guy. So finally, I found one bond speculator who was really well documented, and it was Abigail Adams, who made a killing in the market for depreciated government securities. This is kind of like savings bonds today that were left over from the Revolutionary War. And a lot of them had really depreciated, so you could buy them cheap. And you just needed to know which ones weren't going to end up even cheaper and which ones were going to rise in value. And she was very good at that. And as I said, she made a killing.
Yeah, I want to dig into this idea of Abigail Adams as a bond speculator. But before we dig into her financial investments, I think we should set the scene a bit. In your William and Mary Quarterly article, Abigail Adams, Bond Speculator, you note that of the thousands of soldiers and statesmen separated from their families by the War for Independence, few were gone as long as John Adams, who spent most of the decade from 1774 to 1784 away from his wife. Would you tell us what it was like for Abigail Adams to experience the War for Independence as a married but often single woman?
Well, she often referred to that period as the period of her widowhood. And now in the real sense of that term, she was never a widow because she died in 1818 and her husband died famously in 1826. But she really felt like a widow then. And she meant that it was really the saddest decade of her life. There's a big debate about when did companionate marriage begin, or when will it begin, some people say. But they really had a truly loving relationship. So she missed him terribly. I think that's one of the plus sides of that HBO movie on John Adams, is that it has her doing sweat labor that she didn't really do because she was not of that class, but just shows her really, really missing him. And so on the one hand, in the same way that anybody in a loving relationship would be, to be separated for most of a decade was terrible for her. On the other hand, John's absence, as with so many other men, both politicians like him and soldiers, left his wife in charge of the family finances. And some women who took over the farm messed it up. But the great majority of them did a terrific job of running the family's farm and really got a sense of empowerment from doing that. And Abigail is a classic example of that. In fact, I would say if you look at John Adams's whole long life, from 1735 up till his death in 1826, the single best financial step he ever took to secure his family finances was to leave his family for those 10 years, because that put Abigail in charge. And she was just so much better at it than he was.
What do you think made Abigail so good at keeping the family's finances? Did she happen to come from a merchant family where she learned how to keep books and make investments as she grew up?
No, that's a great question. And it would make sense if she had done so. And that's one of the things, both in writing this article about her bond speculation and in later writing a biography of her, that I plumbed into, and I have some theories about, but could never really get a finger on. So at least for me, it's a mystery. Maybe some other historian will solve it in the future. What was it that made her so much better than John? I mean, one way to break it down is to say that she was a lot bolder than him. In Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara's father says, "Land, Scarlett, that's the only thing worth fighting for and dying for, land." And it's sort of our stereotype as a Southern thing that you got to own land. But John partook of that too, that he thought, the enemy comes, they can burn your house, they can burn your crops, but they can't burn the land underneath them. And so there's something really secure about land. It's good for the individual. It's safe for the society as well, because land is real wealth as opposed to personal property and, worst of all, paper wealth, money and securities and things like that. So John had a much more conservative approach, which Abigail refuted that as, nothing ventured, nothing have, the same way we'd say nothing ventured, nothing gained. So she was just much more of a risk taker than he was. So at one point, for instance, he had some money coming due. He told her to buy land with it. And she said, "Okay, you're my husband. I got to do what you tell me to do. But before I pull the trigger on this land purchase, consider when you rent out land to tenants," which is what he did with most of his land, "you're making about a 1% annual return on your investment. If you'll let me take that same money and instead of buying land, buy more of these depreciated government securities, I can make you 20% a year instead of 1%. Now, as I said, it could end up being nothing. But if you're willing to take a risk at any era, but especially in that very volatile era around the American Revolution, you can do very well." And she was much more of a risk taker than he was, which of course raises the question of why she was much more of a risk taker than he was.
During the 1770s and 1780s, the Adamses were what we consider today to be members of the upper middle class. So they had some money that they could invest. Woody, was it typical for women like Adams and of that class to invest in things during the war? I mean, they're alone with their husbands off rendering some sort of service to their country. But didn't these women still need to seek permission from their husbands in order to make investments? Especially like the investments we're talking about Abigail Adams is having made.
That's right. Well, a couple issues there. The women who were buying a lot of government securities in that era were British women. But you have to understand that in Britain, a government bond is kind of the opposite of what it is in America. That is, for 100 years, the British government had a debt that it managed really well, and you could count on getting your money back. Now, because it was so secure, it only paid 2 or 3% a year. So it was sort of the safe thing to invest in. So there's a woman who's been denied an education and denied any chance to be involved in business, and her husband dies. She's not going to go out and invest in a ship or one of these new factories that were springing up. No, she's just going to buy government bonds as the safe thing to do. So the answer to the question, if we're talking about Britain, is yes, a lot of women bought government bonds, but because it was a safe thing to do. Abigail doing it is wild because here it's the less safe thing to do, and she's the much bigger risk taker than John. You're right, neither of them was born to poverty, but neither was the aristocrat, so I think upper middle class is probably a way to define it. You're absolutely also correct in saying that she can't do anything with money without asking his permission. That's the law. Once a woman gets married, she's considered a femme couverte, a covered woman, and her husband has all the authority. It's not quite correct to say they can't own property because women did inherit land, but they couldn't write a will bequeathing that land to anybody. It just was divided among their kids when they died. And personal property, they couldn't inherit at all. So you're a single woman living in 1776 in America, or afterwards, by the way, because the revolution didn't change this. You have tons of personal property. The second you get married, it all goes to your husband. And he can do whatever he wants with it. He can burn the money. He can give the slaves away in the states where they're considered personal property. It's not yours anymore. That's the law. But one thing that Abigail Adams has in common with other women of that era is that what the law says and what actually happens on the ground are not always the same thing. So she is not unique in this sense that lots of women operated as though they were independent financial actors, even though there was always sort of this sword hanging over them that their husband could swoop in at any point and exert control. But most didn't. I mean, a good example that maybe some of your listeners are familiar with is Martha Ballard, who Laura Ulrich wrote a biography of hers that won the Pulitzer Prize called A Midwife's Tale. And Martha Ballard and her husband just sort of operated in separate economic spheres. They were both making money. She's probably making more than her husband was. But Ulrich compares it to the warp and woof of a piece of cloth, and that she's kind of doing her thing and he's doing their thing, and they're passing each other, but they're not really connected. And that did happen with a lot of women. But Abigail Adams really pushed it to the limit, much more so than other women, in that she not only operated separately, but she made these self-conscious and very specific claims to what she called this money which I call mine. And you can see from that phrase, this money which I call mine, she knew it wasn't hers in the eyes of English law, but she was still asserting her ownership over it. And she used it in very independent ways. For instance, at one point, she was trying to get John Adams to come home from Europe. The war was over, and he had been offered diplomatic opportunities in Europe, but she didn't want him to take them. She wanted him to come home. And she basically took some of this money and said, look, if you'll come home, I know you want to buy Vesey's farm. I'll lend you the money to buy Vesey's farm, but only if you'll come home. And he ended up not coming home, so she didn't lend him the money to buy that farm. In the eyes of the law, the money was always his. But to his credit, this is, I think, one of the most positive things you can say about John Adams. To his credit, he never did step in and go, wait a minute, this is my money, give it up.
Now, in addition to John being away, the economy also forced Abigail to take an active interest in her family's finances. Woody, would you tell us about the American economy during the War for Independence and why bond speculation in particular appealed to Adams as a way to survive and even thrive in that economy?
Well, it was a real nightmare. And I think this is kind of a contrary opinion to what a lot of the expert military historians say. You know, look at the Hamilton musical. There's that line, how could a ragtag volunteer army defeat a global superpower? I actually say that ragtag volunteer army was almost guaranteed to win the Revolutionary War because they were playing defense. You see right at the Battle of Bunker Hill, where the British suffered 50% casualties and understood that they were going to have to give up 50% casualties for every other hill they conquered. And so the British at least believed right after Bunker Hill, this war is unwinnable for Britain. So it's really the British who are the underdogs in the Revolutionary War, with one huge exception, and that is economically. The one way I can imagine the British winning the war in a way that they almost did win the war was economically, because they established a blockade of foreign trade, and America was just as dependent on foreign trade then as it is today. Look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson is growing tobacco. You know, you can only smoke so much of your own tobacco. You got to get that stuff out the door and overseas in order to buy stuff with it. Americans were extremely dependent on foreign trade. So that all shuts down. You get all these people not working because they're off as soldiers. So the American economy really was in shambles. And part of that process was Congress and the states issuing all this paper money that depreciated at the levels that we associate with Zimbabwe or some of the countries in Latin America in more recent times, that is runaway inflation. So you're right, Liz. If you do nothing as an economic actor in revolutionary America, you're going to lose, because people are going to pay the debts that they owe you with paper money that's going to just dissolve down to nothing in your hands, for instance, and lots of other things too. So inaction was really not an option. And so she took some of that paper money, and before it could depreciate, she bought government bonds with it. And they were depreciating too, but not at anything like the rate of the other money, because one of the bonds she bought, for instance, the interest was secretly paid by Congress using the money they'd borrowed from Louis XVI, the King of France. And so she had kind of an insider deal there where she made a killing on those bonds. And she did other things too. While John was over in France as an American diplomat, she had him send her stuff to sell, often using the diplomatic pouch, which still exists today. So this is really kind of malfeasance. This is at government expense. Stuff is coming over from John to Abigail to sell. But because the store shelves were nearly empty, because British ships were capturing American ships trying to bring stuff in, the shelves are about empty. That jacks up the price and she could just about name her own price for the stuff she brings in. And this was the context in which they had one of their shipments seized by the British, and John said, "Oh, I burned my hands. I'm not going to do this anymore." She goes, No, John, you don't understand. If 1 in 3 survives, I should be a gainer. That is, we can have 2 out of every 3 shipments go to the bottom of the ocean, but as long as that third one gets through, we're going to make a profit.
Wow, Adams was bold. Did anyone ever question the fact that her husband worked for the national government and Abigail's importing goods through him in diplomatic pouches and then investing the profits from those goods in government securities?
No, because they didn't know. She took great pains to keep her financial activities secret. So, for instance, when she imported stuff, and didn't do it all the time, I should mention, but she certainly never advertised the fact that she sometimes brought the stuff in at government expense. And she didn't even advertise the fact that she was importing stuff because she hired her nephew as a commission agent. So he got a fixed commission and all the profits went to her. So like many other women, including Ben Franklin's wife, for instance, you don't see her standing behind the counter in the store selling stuff. But she's, you might say, the silent partner in that business, but she's the one putting up the money. She's the one making the profit. And likewise, after the Revolutionary War and after the Constitution was adopted, when Congress finally funded the government debt, she took great pains to find ways to conceal her ownership of government bonds.
So Abigail imported goods from Europe, but she didn't own a store. But she didn't need to own a store because she was able to hire a nephew to sell those goods on her behalf. Woody, this actually makes it sound like Abigail was creating jobs and bringing in money for her entire family during the Revolution's troubled economic times.
That's an interesting point because I think it also goes to the issue of why Abigail was more of a risk taker than John. She wanted money, but not just for her own self and not for her immediate nuclear family, but she had a lot of family members who were in need. It seems pretty clear in retrospect that her family, not John's, but the Smith family, had an alcohol gene. So her brother died of alcoholism. 2 of her sons did as well. So various people were in need. And actually, her sister didn't have an alcohol problem of her own, and neither did her husband. But the guy she married, Richard Cranch, was a visionary, which means he was poor most of the time. He was constantly inventing things or coming up with grand schemes, which meant his family was constantly struggling, and Abigail took care of that family in various ways. So she had a network of people that were dependent on her, and I think that's one reason that she didn't have any qualms. One reason that I didn't mention that John did not want to invest in these depreciated government securities, I mean, we might call them junk bonds today, but it was worse than that because a lot of these were bonds that had been paid out to the soldiers who'd fought in the Revolutionary Army. And, they'd wanted real money, but George Washington had no money to give them. And so he basically gave them IOUs. But a soldier can't eat paper. He needs real money. So he sells that IOU to a speculator at a fraction of its face value. So it's kind of dirty money. And John didn't want to be involved in dirty money. But he sort of let Abigail do it for him. And the reason I think she had less compunction about being involved in dirty money was that she knew that she was going to use the money, yes, for herself, but also for others. As you mentioned, family members. One family member that doesn't often get mentioned with Abigail Adams is the person she described in the 1790s as the only surviving parent I have. And I was pretty astonished to see that this person that Abigail described as the only surviving parent I have was African-American, a woman named Phoebe Abdy, who had been owned by Abigail's father and freed in 1783, both by the father in his will and coincidentally in that same year, Massachusetts abolished slavery. The Supreme Court of Massachusetts abolished slavery. But Phoebe had participated in raising Abigail as a kid. She was a little bit older than her. And by 1783, she was too old to be very productive. And so when Abigail went to Europe herself for 4 years to be with her husband, she turned her house over to Phoebe. And, once in a while, a quart of firewood would show up on Phoebe's porch and things like that. And Phoebe knew really that it was coming from Abigail, even though she didn't always take credit for it. So, yeah, she had a network of poor folks in her neighborhood, including Phoebe, who helped raise her, who she took care of as well. And I do think that's one reason she had so little compunction about being involved in this market for depreciated government securities that John saw as so dirty.
Now, we've talked about the fact that Abigail invested in bonds and that she imported and sold goods during the war. And if we take a look at Woody's research, We'll also see that Adams took an interest in land speculation. Woody, would you tell us about Adams's investment in northern and western lands?
Yes, and another investment, by the way, that she concealed. So Vermont at the time didn't exist as a state. That whole territory between Lake Champlain to the west and the Connecticut River to the east was claimed both by New Hampshire and by New York. And the people pushing the Hampshire grants, ultimately choosing to be a 14th state, this is the Green Mountain Boys. You've heard of Ethan Allen. So they had this speculative notion that we're going to create a new state here. And New York was determined that wasn't going to happen because they wanted that rich land. You know, it's still great dairy land. This is where Ben and Jerry's ice cream comes from. So this is good dairy land, and everybody wants it. During this period of absolute doubt about what's going to happen with Vermont, that's the period when Abigail chose to buy in. That is, get in on the ground floor. And a couple of interesting things about that. So she found this town in northern Vermont where she talks to people projecting this town. There's nobody there. It's all on paper. And she says, okay, what's the maximum amount of acres you can get? I can't remember. I think it was 300 acres. And they go, okay, 300 acres. She goes, okay, I'll take that and name my husband, and also in the name of all three of my sons, and also even in the name of my daughter. The only person that she didn't buy 300 acres in the name of was herself, because as a married woman, she couldn't own property. But even her daughter could, because she was an unmarried woman. So she gets all this land, but the deeds don't, if you go up to the county office in Orleans County in northern Vermont, you don't see Adams' names because the land was deeded to these straw purchasers who then signed it over to the Adams. So again, part of that effort to conceal what she was up to, and specifically that she was violating the 300-acre rule by getting 1,500 acres in the names of her husband and 4 kids. So she wrote John about that and was sort of sheepish about it. He was over in Europe, and she wasn't sure what he was going to think of this. And she was right, because he wrote her back saying, don't meddle anymore with Vermont. So there he is. I mentioned the sword that the husband always had over the wife. Here he really is wielding the sword and saying, cut it out. And she did stop investing in Vermont for the moment. But then later, her father dies. That's in 1783. And it's complicated, but she inherits some property from her father, and she knows that her husband's going to want to sell it. And I told you, a woman who inherits property, she can't decide to sell it. She can't decide how it's, what crops are grown on any. She can't control her in any way. She has one tiny little power, and that is she can veto her husband selling that piece of land. Okay, so she's inherited this land that's somewhere in Massachusetts. She knows her husband doesn't want it. She knows he wants to sell it, but she also knows he can't sell it without her permission. So Abigail writes to John, I will make an exchange with you. That is, I will sign off on you selling this piece of land that you don't want in Massachusetts if you'll let me buy more of the land that I do want in Vermont. I'll make an exchange with you. There cannot be a single phrase that better explodes the myth of the 18th century couple as being one where the husband is completely dominating the wife, because here she is. She's bargaining with him the same way my spouse and I will often bargain with each other, because she's really acting as an equal. She ended up not buying any more Vermont land, but the fact that she went so far as to try to imagine their relationship as one of equals is pretty cool.
Abigail may have imagined her relationship with John as being one composed of 2 equals. But in the eyes of the law, as we've said, Abigail wasn't John's equal. Coverture dictated that all the money she earned from her investments belonged to John. Woody, the world of investments was a male realm in the 18th century. Did the fact that Abigail hid a lot of her investment activity help her hide the fact that she was acting in unfeminine ways? I mean, was she worried that people would see her acting beyond her proper gender role?
Well, I should say, when she's concealing the Vermont purchase and the bond speculation, she's partly shielding John too, because the Vermont purchase, it was basically illegal. I mean, no one really cared because everything about it, Vermont was illegal, but, she's violating the rules of the 300-acre rule, and so that's the reason to conceal that. The bond speculation, John was a strong advocate, even though he was over in Europe, for the U.S. Constitution, and then as vice president, he supported the Funding Act, which produced this huge windfalls for all the owners of the bond. So my point is, even if this had all been done by John, even if he'd been single and not had a wife and just take her out of the equation altogether, there probably would have been the same motivation to conceal, because otherwise his opponents would have said, aha, he supported this legislation which benefited him immensely. because he benefited immensely. I personally don't think that's true. I think that Abigail and John probably would have supported the funding of these securities one way or the other. But my point is that she's not concealing it only because of her gender. The one that she's clearly concealing because of her gender is the business of importing goods. And even there, it's not, lots of women did import goods. They were especially big in selling stuff in the millinery trade, where they're selling stuff to other women, clothing to other women. But women, let's see, Deborah Franklin ran the husband's print shop, as lots of other women did, including editing newspapers, and lots of women ran taverns and so forth. So it's not necessarily bad for women to be in business, but she's a diplomat's wife, upper middle class, as she said, and for her to be kind of getting her hands dirty with business, it's something that women did, but ladies didn't. And so that's, I think, why she concealed that.
So just how successful was Adams as a businesswoman and investor? Do we know how much money she made from her investments over the course of her lifetime?
No, I wish there were financial records that would go to that. There are something like 300 reels of Adams' papers, but it's almost all letters and diaries and narrative stuff like that. There's very little in the way of financial records. But there's a couple of ways you can get at it. One is just compare John Adams' two successors in the White House, Jefferson and Madison, those two Virginians, and really to some extent the third one, Monroe. They all died, not poor, but so deep in debt that those beloved houses, Jefferson's Monticello and Madison's Montpelier, had to be sold just to pay off their creditors. John Adams, by contrast, died on the same day as Jefferson, July 4th, 1826, also in a big mansion, but he didn't have to be sold by his creditors because he had died debt-free. And I would say there's lots of reasons for that. Virginia had problems with tobacco and indebtedness in general. And John would say, it's because I was a smart lawyer and I'd made a lot of money as a lawyer, but he didn't practice a whole lot of law. The real reason that Adams died so much better financial shape than Madison and Jefferson comes down to what Abigail did. And you can see that also in her own will, which I didn't mention to you. Remember, I'm starting way back in 1781. She's got this money, which I call mine, and which John, to his credit, doesn't touch. Lets her continue to operate as an independent actor. And in 1816, January of 1816, she thought she was dying. She actually lived for 2 more years, but she thought she was dying, so she wrote out her will. And she left the equivalent in modern terms of something like $50,000. I think it was $6,000 or so, and we use a multiplier as much as 10,000. It was a ton of money. And she left canal shares and bank shares, as well as the more traditional stuff like clothing. And so her husband died debt-free. She died with lots of money to hand out. And then the very fact that she's handing it out is also exciting because a married woman is not supposed to write a will, because the point of a will is to distribute property. And as a married woman, she owns no property except land, which, again, it automatically passes to her kids, so there's no reason for her to write a will. But she doles out all this personal property. And there's 2 more things to say about the will. One is it's really interesting to see who she gave that money to. And it goes to an issue that you mentioned. Who did she leave it to? She left it to her granddaughters, her nieces, her daughter-in-law, her female servants. She left it all to women. So partly there's a feminine and maybe even feminist solidarity there. But one of the interesting things is a lot of these women that she left this property to were themselves married. And so they don't have any more right to receive this property than she does, again, in the eyes of the law. But she did it anyway, maybe in order to put them in the position, if they wanted to assert the same ownership of property in defiance of centuries of common law, the same way that she had. But then it also goes to a cool thing about John, which is he let her have all this property, and it's all money that she made, so he's not taking it away from her, is the better way to put it. John could be a real sexist pig. When she wrote the Remember the Ladies letter back in 1776, his response to that, when she goes, "Remember the ladies when you write this new code of laws," John wrote back from Philadelphia, where he was in the Continental Congress, "I cannot but laugh." So you just want to strangle him for that. But then here we go. That was in 1776. In 1818, when she died and found this will in her papers, he would have been perfectly within his rights and just throw it in the fire and do as he chose with her canal shares and bank shares and so forth. What he actually did, though, was comply with what she had directed to the letter. Got all that property distributed just the way she said it should be. And actually, in the eyes of the law, by his complying with it, he made it into his document. So everybody's ownership of this property was secure. So that's fine. That took care of the legal situation. But for me, there's sort of the ethical thing that John Adams, despite having made some very piggish comments over the course of his lifetime, he said women shouldn't write history, for instance, when Mercy Otis Warren, the female historian, criticized him. He said some horrible things, and yet when push came to shove, when his wife was dead and she left him this will, he went along with her incredibly bold claim that screw what the law says, I'm going to assert ownership of property and it's going to be mine.
It's apt that you brought up Abigail and John's views on women because many listeners have questions about Abigail's views on women. But before we dive into that aspect of her life, I have one last question about her investments. We've talked about how much success Adams had as an investor, that she invested in goods, bonds, land, canal shares. Did she ever make any bad investments? I mean, did any of her investments ever flop?
That is a terrific question. No one's ever asked me that. I cannot think of one. The Vermont land, it didn't really come to fruition until after her death, but that was a decent investment. Obviously, some of her shipments from Europe were either captured or went to the bottom. But no, I can't think of any of her investments that did not work out. Now, she would lend money to other people for ventures. For instance, a couple of her sons were not great financial people, and so she would support them in ventures that didn't work out. But in terms of her own purchases, it's funny you mention that because her son-in-law, William Smith, did a bunch of land speculation, and she denounced him for that and said, oh, speculation is such a horrible idea. I remember pointing this out to somebody when I was working on my biography of Abigail Adams of, how can she, who's made so much money as a speculator, criticize her son-in-law for being a speculator? And as someone pointed out to me, I can't remember who it was, well, for her, what she was doing wasn't speculation because it was a sure thing.
Well, it definitely sounds like Adams was a savvy investor. Now, when we think about Abigail Adams, we don't typically think about her career as an investor, but about her advocacy for women's rights and liberties. Some of us may even think about Adams as an early feminist. Joseph would like to know more about Adams's views on women's rights and social standing. So Woody, would you tell us about Adams's views of women and about their place in 18th and early 19th century American society?
Sure. Well, Joseph's question is a great transition from what I've been talking about to her spoken views, because you can really see in her actions that she was trying to set up her own home as a sort of an experiment. What would it be like if the laws were equal? And I also think it's not a coincidence that she didn't start asserting ownership of property until about the time of the Battle of Yorktown, that is Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. And I think it was clear to her at about that time that the American men had won the American Revolution, but American women had not, that there was not going to be changes to the code of laws, and that sure enough, she was correct that there were very few changes that benefited women, and they were just as oppressed by the law in independent America as they had been before. So that's when she decided to defy the law, basically, in her own home. So I do think the best evidence for her feminism is not the spoken words that we're familiar with, but what she did within her own home. But it's also exciting to talk about those spoken words, because one of the things that I noticed just going through her 2000 letters is that she didn't just express that remember the lady's viewpoint to her husband, but to lots of other men, and especially to her nieces, and to some extent her granddaughters. Less interestingly, to her own daughter. She did ensure that her daughter, also called Abigail, but called Nabby within the family, that Nabby learned Latin, which had really been a male preserve. But the ones who she really expressed it to were her nieces, and she complained about being denied an education herself and pushed her nieces to get education because a few opportunities were starting to open up for women. Still, of course, no colleges were taking women, but they could attend lectures in science and math in a way that she hadn't been able to as a kid, and she managed to do herself actually over in Britain. So the main thing I would like to say about her advocacy for women is that it was not expressed only to her husband. We all know the Remember the Lady's letter that she wrote John on March 31st, 1776, but she expressed it to other men, she expressed it to other women, especially her nieces. The other thing to say is people can make their own decisions about whether to call her a feminist. I ended up with proto-feminist, which was kind of my hedge, but here's why I didn't want to say feminist. She never demanded the right to vote, for instance. She didn't like the fact that women couldn't vote or hold office and expressed that often, but she saw that, I think, as just too much to even demand. So she never did make that demand. Sheila Skimp, the biographer of Judith Sargent Murray, a feminist who was really much more radical than Abigail, roughly a contemporary of hers, she never did either. Actually, you really have to wait for the Seneca Falls Declaration before you get an organized effort by women to demand the right to vote. There had been a few women, actually, Mary Willing Byrd in Virginia had expressed that. And of course, you had New Jersey women voting, beginning through what most of us consider a fluke in the law, but continuing to assert that. But anyway, so she didn't ask for the right to vote. And even beyond that, she would often describe men as the natural protectors of women. You know, it's the sort of thing, if you read that on the internet now, you say, oh my God, what a troglodyte. So if you judge her by our standards, you really can't call her a feminist, but she certainly was way ahead of what men were allowing. I don't want to necessarily say she was way ahead of other women because we don't have 2,000 letters from 99.9% of women of her time. So we don't know as much about what they were thinking. There are little glimpses that ordinary women held views somewhat similar to Abigail's, but just didn't have as much opportunity to express it. One of the symptoms that I like to point to is how frequently women of that era referred to men as the lordly sex, and they mean it sarcastically, is that the men set themselves up as the lords of creation. You see that phrase a lot in women talking about men. And so, you know, sarcasm, as I know from having an almost teenage child of my own, sarcasm is a great way for people to say what they really mean. And I think some of the sarcastic attitude that a lot of women express without expressing clearly stated feminist ideals, I think that indicates that Abigail may not have been so distinctive in that sense.
You just noted that Abigail left us 2,000 letters. And I wonder, do you think it's possible that she shared these same ideas about women and their place in the world with her daughter Abigail as she did with her nieces? But since Nabby and Abigail lived together, we don't have those letters between them, and so we don't know she was sharing those views?
Yeah, that's a fair point. But, you know, her daughter didn't always live at home. Eventually, her daughter married, and there's wonderful correspondence between them on other issues. I hate to say this, but I think that Abigail did not see her daughter as especially strong. And so I think Abigail saw herself as passing the feminist torch on to her nieces more so than to Nabby. This is another whole story which we could probably spend another hour on, but to give you a short version of this, if there's an unlikable aspect of both Abigail and John Adams, it's their child raising. One way to put it is that of their 4 children who made it to adulthood, they told 3 of them not to marry the person they actually loved, but to marry somebody else or to wait or whatever. And that really ended up in a tragic way for John Quincy Adams, who was in love with a woman named Rebecca Fraser, who they all both said, you're too young and you haven't made your mark yet as a lawyer. You know, let her go and there'll be another one. And there was another, and there was Louisa Catherine Adams, who he eventually married. And they were good partners, but it wasn't the same. And I wouldn't describe it as a loving marriage. Some people do. It's a debate, I guess. And likewise with Nabby. Nabby was in love with the guy who wrote what's considered the first American play, The Contrast, Royal Tyler. And they said, I don't marry him. And I will say he turned out to have his problems, but not as many as the guy she ended up marrying because of her parents' intervention, William Smith, this speculator guy that I was talking about. And I think Tommy, they tried to get him not to marry the person he wanted to, and he went ahead, so I'm wrong on that one. But my point is that they intervened in all of their kids' choices of whom to marry with often disastrous results. And the irony of that is that Abigail's parents had tried to prevent her from marrying John. Not so much that he was a bad guy. You know, he's a shoemaker's son, so he's not of the same class as her. But the bigger issue was that he was just getting started, and they said, I'm thinking of Sound of Music, wait a year or two. Hang on, let's see how he does before you commit yourself. And it's kind of sad that having really hated the fact that her parents were trying to prevent Abigail and John from marrying, that Abigail and John replicated that behavior with their own kids.
John would like to know how John Adams's colleagues viewed Abigail and whether they viewed her as using her access to John to influence his views on policy.
Well, to answer the second part of that question first, absolutely, yes. Once American politics had degenerated into something very similar to what we're experiencing today, that is in the 1790s of the Federalists that we associate with John Adams and Alexander Hamilton versus the Jeffersonian Republicans, mostly based in Virginia, with not only Thomas Jefferson, but Madison once those clear party lines were set, then everything was fair game. And yes, people on the other side, the Jeffersonian side, liked to imagine that Abigail was dictating John's policies to him. And that sounds like pure political rhetoric, but I think the one grain of truth in that is that Abigail did push John to be more radical in one area, and that is one of the biggest issues during his presidency, which ran from 1797 to 1801, was this quasi-war with France. And she was sort of rabidly anti-French. She had never liked the French, spent a few months over there with him and really just didn't get along with them. And she also was rabidly anti-revolution. So hating the French, hating revolutionaries, French Revolution was not her cup of tea. And she pushed him to declare war. They never formally declared war against France, but she wanted him to. And so, yes, she did play a role in his politics. And yes, that was an issue for his political opponents.
Nick would like to know whether you found anything in your research that surprised you about Adams and made her more relatable to you. He'd also like to know how you were able to maintain your objectivity about Adams as you wrote a biography of her and spent so much time with her papers.
Well, let me take Nick's objectivity question first. I'm one of those historians who believes that it's impossible to be objective, although it is possible to be fair. But one of the pleasures of writing this book, it was sort of an unexpected pleasure for me, was that I kind of loved Abigail Adams on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and hated her on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday, because there are a lot of things about her that are relatable, which I'll mention in a second, but there's also a lot of things to not like about her. My previous book had been somewhat trying to bring the soldiers who got ripped off after the Revolutionary War more into the forefront. So many people celebrate people like Hamilton, and now we've got this musical that just makes him sound like a working class hero. And I was hedging against that in my book. And Abigail clearly is on Hamilton's side in that sort of snotty attitude towards ordinary people, and this willingness to exploit ordinary people by buying up those depreciated government securities and making as much money as she did off of them. So I found her bond speculation, on the one hand, you kind of admire. Here she is, a woman who's not even supposed to own property, not trained in business. She makes a lot of money for her family and for her network of people that she's supporting. On the other hand, she's doing it at the expense of these soldiers who are now paying the taxes that are enriching her with these windfalls from their bonds that they'd had to sell. Oh, and then I've just mentioned that her interference in her kids' choice of spouses, that was a real problem. So there's lots of things, frankly, about both Abigail and John to loathe. On the other hand, there's all these things where you kind of go, you go, girl. And so this is the first book I've written where I felt as ambivalent about a character as I do, in this case, the main character. And it was kind of a breakthrough for me because without giving you my whole history as a historian, I tended to write about people that other historians had disparaged, and that tended to make me excessively a champion for those people and willing to overlook their faults. But with Abigail, it's impossible, I think, if you read the letters with any sense of fairness and the other evidence, it's impossible to either love her or hate her. You end up doing both. And so that's not the objectivity that Nick is talking about, but to me, that's better to have a subject who you both love and hate. And I will say I'm working on a book now that I'm tentatively calling Liberty and Death and the Ambiguous American Revolution, that she's really helped me see the ambiguity in the Revolutionary era that I couldn't see back when I was championing other people that I thought other historians had disparaged. Now, he also said what big surprises. I've mentioned a bunch of them, but one that makes her relatable. I'm older than most young parents, but I am a parent of young kids. And a lot of her stuff about, the baby's sick, is it just kind of colicky or is this something more serious? Should we call the doctor? And the baby hits his head, and so she hears from a friend that, there's this thing you can get to put on their head, this cap, which I wish I'd had sometimes I want to put a bicycle helmet on my kids just when they go out into a playground because I'm a worried parent. A lot of that was extremely relatable. A lot of historians, I think Gordon Wood is probably the one who does this the most urgently, say, hey, don't think you understand everything in the past. And I understand what he's talking about. It's a pre-modern world. We live in this high-tech world. And in many ways, it's like a different planet, not just a different era. So I hear what he's saying about that. On the other hand, particularly when reading what she wrote as a young parent, I found her almost hauntingly relatable to the issues that I deal with as a young parent myself.
Woody, it's time for the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened to the Adams family if Abigail had not invested in bonds, lands, and goods during the War for Independence?
I think they could have come out of the Revolution in the same bad financial straits as John's successors in the presidency, Jefferson and Madison, both of whom ended up having their heirs. So their executors had to sell their farms just to pay their debts. I mentioned that Jefferson and Madison had the distinctive problem of being Virginians, and the Virginia economy was in trouble after the Revolutionary War. But I should also mention that people ending up with big debts was not a uniquely Southern phenomenon. Think of James Wilson, who was on the Supreme Court, but ended up himself in debtor's prison. Or Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, one of the wealthiest men in America. And a lot of people say it was his financial acumen that prevented the British from defeating the Americans economically and thus winning the Revolutionary War. Morris and Wilson are both Philadelphians who ended up in debtor's prison. And we could cite examples of other people closer to the Adamses in Massachusetts. I'll give you another example. Thomas Paine writes Common Sense in 1776, and in this sort of burst of revolutionary enthusiasm, Paine says, all the profits we're going to give to the Revolutionary Army. And I think that's an amazingly admirable gesture, but it's also a reason that Paine was in such bad financial straits himself 6 years later in 1782 that he had to go to his arch enemy, Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, and say, I'll write essays advocating your policies, which at that time were high taxes, in order to benefit bond speculators like Abigail Adams. I'll advocate your policies if you'll pay me to do so. That is, he became the thing he hated most, a hireling scribbler. And so my point is that lots of people, North and South, during the Revolutionary era, who either were too committed to their ideals, in Paine's case, or too committed to owning land and living the life of a medieval landowner with all of his retainers and so forth, as John Adams clearly was. That was his sensibility, land. There were lots of people who did that and who ended up really in bad financial straits, either dying in debtor's prison, having their executors have to sell off their estate, or worst of all, in the position of Tom Paine, having to sell out their beliefs. And it's not impossible for me to imagine that happening with John Adams because he was such a bad money manager. He prided himself on being a bad money manager because, I'm too good to worry about money. It was absolutely essential for him that he have somebody who would do the dirty work for him. There was a comedian when I was a kid named Flip Wilson whose line was, "The devil made me do it." And for John, Abigail was the devil. That is, he is over in France denouncing bond speculators. Meanwhile, Abigail is making him a bond speculator, and he's tacitly consenting to that. So I think your counterfactual is a great one to ask. Take Abigail out of the equation. She gets smallpox in 1775, the year before she's actually inoculated against it, and dies of that. And he doesn't remarry, or he marries somebody who has the same ideas about money. He could have really ended up in trouble.
Earlier, you started to tell us about your current research project. Would you now tell us more about it?
Well, I've reached the age where, having taught the Revolution so many times, I felt like, okay, I got to write a synthesis of the American Revolutionary era. And it's been fun researching. One of the things I've discovered is that I've been teaching about 10% of the American Revolution in my classes. I don't know how I'm going to cram everything that seems important to me now into the class next time I teach it. But that's what I'm trying to do, is a general history of the Revolution that has both the people that I've traditionally been interested in, Native Americans, women, African Americans, the sort of outsiders, while also talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the signing of the peace treaty in 1782 and 1783. But it's really been fun to integrate the traditional military, political, diplomatic history with the social history that has been my specialty up until now. But really fun things happen when you integrate the timeline. I'll give you an example that will kind of maybe give you a taste of the book that I'm working on. You know the expression Empire of Liberty, which Gordon Wood used for his book about the period. I think that book covers 1783, 1815, something like that, the period right after the American Revolution. Other people have used that same book title, Empire of Liberty, as this sort of inspiring description of America. Well, go back and see where it comes from. The first person to describe the United States as Empire of Liberty is Thomas Jefferson as governor of Virginia, and he's talking about sending George Rogers Clark out to conquer Detroit, a failed expedition, by the way. We're going to conquer Detroit in order to make the area that's west of the Ohio River part of the Empire of Liberty. That is, it's part of exterminating the Indians, a phrase he also used, to get them off of that land and turn that land into part of the Empire of Liberty. Okay, so that's December 25th, Christmas Day, 1780, that Jefferson became the first person to describe the United States as the Empire of Liberty. But working on this book and really moving through it chronologically through the Revolutionary era, I have noticed that when Jefferson wrote that letter, his wife, Martha Jefferson, had just gotten a letter from Martha Washington describing this effort that had begun in Philadelphia in June of 1780, so 6 months earlier, where women are raising a bunch of money. They want to give cash to the soldiers, but George Washington convinced them to give them shirts instead. But the broadside, that is the flyer advertising this women's fundraising effort, is written by Esther DeBert Reed, who's in charge of the effort. And she prefaces it by saying, you know, there's all these cool women in history who have done great stuff like Queen Elizabeth and the present Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, and all of them have worked hard to extend the Empire of Liberty. So Jefferson, when he coined that term for the United States, had in his hand a letter that his wife had gotten in which Esther Reed, advertising that women's fundraising organization, had used that term, Empire of Liberty. So I don't think it's too much of a leap to say that Jefferson got it from Esther Reed. So that's the kind of fun stuff I've been coming up with just by integrating the women's history timeline with the Native American history timeline, the African American history timeline, and the battles timeline.
Now, I can't believe it, but Woody, this is the 150th episode of Ben Franklin's World. And to celebrate, the Omohundro Institute has made your William & Mary Quarterly article, Abigail Adams' Bond Speculator, available for free in the OI Reader app. So aside from looking up your work in the OI Reader, is there another place where we should go to find out more about your work and how we can contact you?
Let's see. Well, I'm easy to find at the University of South Carolina website, and Amazon has pretty good write-ups and reviews, not all of them positive, but pretty descriptive reviews of my books. And so that would be a way to proceed, I guess, about that. But that was nice. I hadn't heard about the Institute putting up my Abigail Adams article. I really appreciate that.
Woody Holton, thank you so much for joining us as our guest on our 150th episode and for taking us through the fascinating financial life of Abigail Adams.
Yeah, thanks to you and to your readers, Liz, for those great questions, none of which I've been asked before, so that's always fun to get new questions.
This money, which I call mine. The American Revolution forced many women to assume what was traditionally men's work, like running the family's shop, tending the family's farm, and taking care of the family's finances. Like many women, Abigail Adams took on jobs normally performed by her husband during the American Revolution and its war for independence. And from Woody's account, it's a good thing for the Adams family that she did, because Abigail Adams was a savvy investor. She was savvy enough that she expanded her family's finances during a period of economic turmoil. And she expanded them enough that she was able to declare some of that money hers. This money, which I call mine. Now, of course, legally, all of the money that Abigail made from her investments in bonds, lands, and imported goods belonged to John. Coverture meant, as soon as she married, a woman's legal rights and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband. Her property was his property. Yet, as Woody related, John let Abigail have her property, and for the most part, he also let her make the investments she wanted to make. John even turned her 1816 will, which was not a legal document because, as a married woman, Abigail had no property to bequeath. John made her will into a legal document by executing its wishes after Abigail's death in October 1818. But why was Abigail so keen on making and dispensing money in the first place? For Abigail, money seemed to be both a source of power and independence, a way she could keep her family together and afloat in troubled economic times, and a way for her to demonstrate to her family and the world that women could be responsible caretakers of property, should men ever grant them the legal right to own property. Now, it would be inaccurate for us to call Abigail Adams a feminist, because it's a 20th century term that doesn't fit 18th century worldviews. But we can definitely call Adams a smart, resourceful woman who advocated for greater rights and legal status for women. You can find more information about Woody, his book Abigail Adams, plus notes for everything about this episode on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/150. Plus, thanks to the Omohundro Institute, which publishes the William and Mary Quarterly, the leading journal of early American history since 1943, you can read Woody's article, Abigail Adams' Bond Speculator, for free in the OI Reader app. And since episode 150 is a big deal, our friends at the Adams Papers editorial project at the Massachusetts Historical Society are helping us celebrate. They have made available images of Abigail Adams' will, her Remember the Ladies letter, and some other documents for you to look at. You'll find all of these documents with Woody's article in the OI Reader app. Now, as a reminder, you can download the OI Reader app for free for all your favorite iOS and Android devices by searching for the OI Reader in your favorite app store or by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/OI Reader. And thank you, Omohundro Institute and the Adams Papers editorial project for making episode 150 just a bit extra special by providing us with these bonus resources. Okay, so what do you think of Abigail Adams' investment schemes? If you had lived during the American Revolution and had the cash, would you have invested your money in depreciated government bonds? And remember, you may know what your return will be, but you can't know that the United States will make good on these bonds. Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.